Paleo to Pioneer presents Small Batch Science, Episode 7.
Hi, I'm Andy, and today we're going to talk about early Paleo-Indian perishable or organic technology. Predominantly it'll be ivory, bone, antler, teeth, and then some other, more durable things. But we'll start out talking about a few even softer bits of technology. And by early Paleo-Indian, I'm really just meaning specifically Clovis and a couple of pre-Clovis examples. The world gets much more complicated, and a lot more survives when we get into the Holocene or after Clovis times, after the end of the Pleistocene. So limit our focus to the earliest material across the hemisphere for the time being, and talk about a bunch of really spectacular examples, and try and keep hammering home the notion that we're trying to get at a better understanding of patterns in prehistoric human behavior. And I'll come back to that for a number of reasons, and show some pretty interesting examples of continuity and divergence with old world antecedents, basically upper Paleolithic things, from some Gravettian examples, and Magdalenian, I think, are the ones I have. And I'll show those for a moment or two for a reason, and in a little bit here. But for now, we'll start off with one of the older things that I have a cast of, and this was found at Page Ladson, vertically pounded into a sediment layer roughly 14,000 years old, and was believed to be like a tent stake. It's not a very good cast. It's the only one I've ever been able to get, but you get the idea that the end's been whittled or sharpened, and it really is a unnatural looking item. It's most certainly an artifact, and being pounded into the ground like this is very suggestive, but is that really what it is? It's hard to say. But the fact that it was in a very good, secure, datable context underwater means we can wrangle about it in perpetuity because it survived. Out at Galt, there's a whole bunch of these now, engraved limestone. I don't know if you want to call them plaquettes, sort of cribbing from the Europeans, but there's little geographic, sometimes just geometric designs, sometimes something more figural. I'll hold it up this way. There's little sort of diamonds at the top, variously interpreted as grass or like wheat, or fletching on darts. There's going to be a lot of opinions, and today you're getting mine on all this stuff, but we're going to argue about this kind of stuff forever. There's a bunch of these that are on limestone out at Galt. I want to say 30 or 40 or 50 of them from Clovis levels, and a number of additional ones from other levels. And we're going to finish this section, pause, and go put a pig back in its pen, and then we'll do the more formal bone and ivory tools. So if we can finish this before she comes over here, and she's coming. This is some cordage. When you get to hafting things like Clovis points, you have two options really, cordage and sinew, and we have examples of both, but this is a pretty decent piece of twine that is similar to, or most similar to, what we found at Vero, much younger, and unfortunately not a Paleo-Indian example, but a nice 3-ply piece of cordage. Every now and then in Florida's rivers, and this is just a modern elk bone piece that I've been working on making something out of, we'll find bone tools or ivory tools where there's evidence of mastic that's sort of fossilized, and then oftentimes there will be cordage imprints in it. And these are two examples rolled in dental molding material, and you can't see them, I understand, don't worry about it, but they are examples of 2-ply S-spun Z-twist and 2-ply Z-spun S-twist. So they're actually very different, and this is Ottavazio. I'm cribbing from him entirely. He identified them. I'm getting better, but I can't really tell for sure. But obviously these are things we know early Paleo-Indian people back into the upper Paleolithic in the old world were using. Here we have smattering of evidence 7,000-8,000 years ago, 13,000-14,000 years ago, and potentially beyond that as well. It just is rarely preserved, and let alone even more rarely found in a meaningful context. So the few pieces we have are of course of great interest, and I'll come back to I'll reset this now, and we'll come back to the more formal stuff in just a minute. Hi, welcome back to the North Florida Hog Report. That was 2 Berkshires that got out, and now they're finally rounded up. If you need a piglet and you're in the North Florida area, shoot us a note. She's about ready to pop. So, I want to show a few pieces of Upper Paleolithic art from particularly Dolní Věstonice, I want to say Czech Republic, between 27 and 31,000 years old. These are a bunch of ivory, they call them plaquettes, but what's important here and why I want to bring these up is not that they're just, you know, not like the big bone tools or the points or shafts or all these other things that I have for New World examples, but that there's ornamentation, not particularly ornate on the examples I'm going to use here, but they're very similar to lots of things that we do know from North America. This is a modern bone example of a needle, but it's a pretty decent approximation of the 2 tips of ivory needles that we now know from sloth wool. They're both, you know, about like that. But clearly, you know, similar kind of tool. Suspect, of course, that they were eyed needles, and that's why I'm holding them up with a little piece of worked ivory from the old world. Some weird curved ivory piece with little tick marks across it, and then longer design elements. But boy, that's starting to look like something that came out of sloth wool there. Another ivory piece. Beyond ornamentation, in terms of a function, I have really no idea. Everybody's guess is as good as everybody else's, although there's some really bad ideas floating around out there. We won't bog down on that just yet. The point I do want to make, though, is beyond just comparatively simple ornamentation, zigzag designs, a zipper kind of design, very similar to one of the bone rods from the Clovis cache out in East Wenatchee, Washington. There is some similarity with a surprising frequency. It's not as alien from Old World to New World, and I'm using European examples, but Siberian and Eurasian or Asian examples would be, I just don't have casts of them, but they're similar. However, there's a big caveat I want to hang on these, and that is once we get beyond that ornamentation and such, you get into things like the Venus figures, and this is one again from Dolní Věstonice, 27 to 31,000 years old, give or take. But this is made out of clay, and the start of the use of clay, there's 4 little, apparently her head is a 4-dotted die. I don't know what's going on there, but making something very obviously non-utilitarian out of clay. There is one Clovis example, and it is from Clovis. It's from Blackwater Draw, locality number 1. It's in the collection at TARL at the Texas Archaeological Research Lab, and I can put pictures of it on the website when I get to it. But there's some clay object from Clovis. It's a little tiny pot-looking thing. It's about 1 inch across and about 3/4 of an inch high. And if you imagine if you took a piece of clay and wrapped it around the end of your finger, almost like those things you had on the end of your pencils when you were a kid, it's a little round lump that's like a little tiny bowl, and it's the only clay object or early Paleo-Indian clay artifact that I know of, but they do exist. So we'll move away from some old world stuff and come now to Clovis and potentially pre-Clovis. Most of these are not dated. A lot of these found underwater in Florida, made from identifiable elements of identifiably extinct taxa, help place it in the Pleistocene. But does that mean it's Clovis? Is it potentially Simpson, Page-Ladson, or some other pre-Clovis culture? I don't know. 20 years ago I would have just said it's Clovis and not worried about it, but clearly that's not going to cut it these days, and the answer to that is we got to date more of them. And as dating becomes more precise, and presumably it seems more accurate, that becomes more and more feasible, along with doing all the other kinds of things like we discussed in the second of the ivory tool videos, things like the stable isotopes, DNA, and all those kinds of things. So a lot of what I'll be talking about here is discussed in the Clovis Technology book, which we refer to often. A number of these bigger gray pieces and a couple other things were first brought up by Dave Webb and Jim Dunbar in a 1996 chapter in Anderson and Sassaman's Paleo-Indian in the Southeast. and I don't think that chapter was left in the revision. I'm not even sure if that's out yet, but I think something else about Florida was done, so it's not, you have to go to the original first edition if you want to see that. But there's some really spectacular things. One important distinction to make, and it's very, very controversial the world over in archaeology, is making the distinction between, in stone tools we would call it basically formal versus informal or expedient tools, basically the difference between, you know, a flake versus a Clovis point. In the organic technologies, in these examples, staying with the osseous stuff, bone, antler, ivory, and enamel or teeth. Okay, nobody's going to ever argue that this is not an artifact. This is obviously a human-made artifact. We don't have any problem with that. The tent stake out of wood, maybe we argue about that, but that one's not a particularly bad example. Bones that are just broken and are kind of pointy and jaggedy fill the archaeological literature, and it's awful. My first real dose in the published view of that and dealing with that was when I went and was working at Tarl with the Galt folks and going through the collections and seeing all the bone and ivory tools, air quotes intentional, from Clovis. There was virtually no bone tools in that assemblage described by Hester in 73. They were broken, pointy things that had no unequivocal human modification. And that's really the gist of it. These are unequivocally modified by humans. If it's equivocal, if you can't rule out other natural possibilities, and I'm not talking about trying to prove a negative, what I'm saying is either you can demonstrate that a human being did it or not, then you can't count it until you can exclude natural processes. And it's a huge problem in Paleo-Indian archaeology. It doesn't seem to be in the Americas as big a problem later. We just don't worry about it, in part because there's so much else for people to study and worry about. But early on, we don't have a whole lot, and what's sitting on this table represents an awful big percentage of it. So yeah, this will probably be a thing on its own. There's so many people arguing about it, and it's awful. Maybe I should just do a talk about that at some point, but we'll skip a little bit, and I'll just tell some stories now, because there's a number of these things known. The first organic Clovis artifacts were found right there in 1936 in the Mammoth pit with the 2 mammoths and the 6 or 7 fragments and complete Clovis stone points. This is, again, a piece from Anzig that I've shown before, but bone from Anzig. Even the cast has a nice representation of the red ochre on it and such. One of the big bone rods from Anzig, found in 68, and then more of that stuff turned up over a few years. Late 80s, excavated about 1990, or in 1990. There was about 11 of these that are complete, a couple more that seem to have been gnawed up by wolverines that didn't survive the wolverining. From Wenatchee, that we really have no idea what they're for or what they were intended to be used with or whatever. There are all kinds of weird, strange ideas, sled runners, big pinchers that hold things, like a point could be hafted between them and then tied down. I honestly, I hate all of the ideas that are out there, but I don't have a better one. So for what that's worth, I just think we don't know what they were used for or how they were used. I don't think we even have a good understanding of why they are bi-beveled. I want to bring up something else. Every one of these little sides could be a talk in and of itself, but there's a real problem here on both of these pieces from Anzig. First off, bone deforms before it breaks. And if you've ever broken a bone, you know what it felt like before it gave, that it started giving and flexing, and then it went. Well, that's what happens with green bone. There's a wonderful bunch of papers on what hidden length of the strands of collagen in the bone actually do and stuff. The mechanics of it is really incredible. This is not curved. This rod from Anzig is made from 3 individual pieces. This one here, that were glued back together. And if you look closely, you can see that they are actually curved. They deformed prior to fracture. This piece should be flat, just like the Wenatchee things. And it's not, because as it gave, and prior to giving, it flexed and deformed the bone. The other one, and I don't know who did these, Dennis Stanford gave me these a number of years ago, but there's liberties taken here that unfortunately get into our minds when we think about these sites, and they are just flat out wrong. They are fabrications, and it's not good. This is one of the bone points, single beveled, but they called it a foreshaft. However, this is entirely fantasy. The end was deteriorated. It wasn't there. They didn't know. So because they decided it was a foreshaft and that it was going to go like this with a point hafted on it, they made it up. This is not real. You can never, ever, ever look at Anzig and say, that's a foreshaft. It's not. The real one has been reconstructed in a way that is not based on anything other than, I want it to be a foreshaft, and that's no good. So, I do have happy stories here. There's more fun things here, and they're coming. I put out all of the ivory things, the addle hooks, the points, the barb point, the awl. I mentioned the needles, and you see, of course, the a barb right there. It would have been hafted to sit up, not necessarily on another bone piece, but it could have been like that. It could be on a bone piece, it could be on ivory, or even a stone. You can make a real heck of a add on to your point there that is not coming apart and is not coming out of a wound as well. One of the strangest things that's turned up is a piece that I know if you're looking at it, you're saying bannerstone, and I think bannerstone. The holes I drilled in the cast are pretty accurate. It was in fact broken right down the middle and mended to make the mold, or to make the cast. But in fact it was also, that break is prehistoric and the mend is prehistoric. So here's where this gets really interesting. No idea how old this is. It was a surface find, but if you look real closely, you see the holes. It's pitted and porous all over both sides. Get my hand out of the way. As well as on the ends. Those are bubbles in the cast, ignore those, but the little tiny ovate ones. This is not cortical bone. It's entirely cancellous trabecular interior bone, the spongy bone on the inside of any given element. What's really interesting here is there's about 4 animals on the Pleistocene landscape in Florida that this could possibly be from. The centrum of a vertebrae of a mammoth, a mastodon, or maybe one of the 2 bigger sloths, maybe even megalonyx, but I don't think so. I'd have to say probably paramylodon or Rematherium, and that's about it. And those 2 are really, really rare. They're present at 2 archaeological sites, so most likely this is made from the centrum of a mastodon or a mammoth vertebrae. You know, the big circular pieces are about this big. Some are 3-4 inches thick, some are narrower and actually higher. That's about the only place you could get a piece of cancellous trabecular bone that's this dense and yet has no cortex and is, of course, straight, which is another big problem. One of the really interesting things in a lot of the ivory coming from tusks is sort of a separate category, but a lot of the other tools made from bones, over here we have I'll pull it up. One of, I think we're up to 4 or 5 of these things known. This is from a 3rd metatarsal of a horse, and for lack of a better term, I've just called them daggers. Nice hole drilled in them. Does that mean they're hung or a pocket holster? I don't know. But 3 or 4 of these are known. These 2 are from the lower portion of the main run of the oscilla. Metatarsals, always metatarsals. Throughout almost all of the deer bone tools you'll see in the Holocene, they're picking metatarsals, which are, of course, the longest, straightest bone in a deer. The metacarpals are a little bit shorter, and you can get a pretty big piece out out of the metacarpals, but very, very strong selection for metatarsals. There is a similar piece to the dagger, unfinished, that really has most of the bone still intact, at least on one end, of a palaeolama that I've seen. Again, they pick the metatarsal. Lots of times out in the plains, this is a cow, but again, a metatarsal instead of a metacarpal. And also, here's an example from a medium-sized, or pretty good-sized elk. 20 Baker got me that. But the reason for that is sort of trifold. Longest, straightest, strongest piece of bone that you can get in one shot, and boy, these guys knew it. Whoever was making bone and ivory or bone tools is selecting very heavily for one element, whatever the species is, or across multiple species is probably the better way to say that. And it's because it's, again, the thing that I kind of harped on last time, trying to maximize performance, and that's really, I think, what they're after here. Well, I could go on for quite a while. What I'm going to do is just show some of the other really neat things here. And I'll tell you one of my favorite stories in all of archaeology. This is from Murray Springs, out in southeast Arizona, not too far from Fort Huachuca and Sierra Vista. You notice that the bone wrench, and I do air quotes here because we don't know what it is, we think it's a shaft wrench, and that it's got paired wear patterns there and there. In fact, when I got the cast from the Arizona State Museum, I realized there's actually 3 wear patterns. There's the 2 where this is contacting going in and out of the hole, and on the end, on both sides. I'll let you see a close-up of that for a second. You see how it's sort of wearing a eye-shaped hole out of what seems to have been a circular hole. This is all cortical bone, pretty reasonably, I think, to believe to be made from a mammoth. But it's one of my favorite stories in all of archaeology because I hate the comet idea, and we can get into that. That's a different idea, but they hang a lot of their story for that on their hat gets hung on the hook of Murray Springs is one of the places where the black mat is after the Clovis occupation of the site. Never mind that it's algal and not extraterrestrial. But at Murray Springs, it's the one Clovis site out of, what, 2,000 loci that we know of, where you can actually point to and say, after the Clovis people were there, the mammoths were still on site. And it's because of that silly tool. I have a picture here of that item in situ, and you can see where the break is, and I don't know if that's Vance Haynes or somebody else's finger pointing, but I couldn't get a very good image of it. But this is what's really funny. As they're excavating the site, they came down and they found a mammoth trackway. A mama and her baby walked right through the site, going off, I guess, towards the water hole. I'm not positive of that. After they'd done that, made some casts, they excavated the footprints. Mama stomped this in two. A mammoth broke this after the Clovis people had been there. The comet story aside, it's the one site where you can point to and say, we know without a doubt that after the Clovis people had been there, and how much time it took for that dirt to pile up on top, if it's a storm a week later, or it's 100 years, I don't know that we know that. I don't know if we could figure that out now. But the mammoths were there after the Clovis people, which is a kind of cool story. We'll start moving east from there a little bit. This is a really interesting piece. Obviously, with all of the flake stone technology, we know that they had to have billets. The only things we see with any regularity seem to be cortical chert or limestone cobbles that are used that have soft, they're sort of like an intermediate hard hammer, soft hammer, kind of in between. And every now and then we'll see, I have a couple examples from Sloth Hole and other places in the Alcilla. I think there's some examples at Gulp, but I have to check to make sure of that. I don't know that that's published yet. And there are a handful of known Clovis, early Paleo-Indian hammerstones that are limestone cortex. So it's not exactly the same as using a nice river cobble, but it sort of serves an intermediary purpose. We know that there's also Antler. This is from Sloth Hole. I just had a picture of it, and you can see that it's cut on the tip and is most certainly being used as a pressure flaker. I just had a antler that's not modified like that I use modern usage today, but the same sort of punch-looking tool. But this one's made out of ivory, and it's really something special. It's really something interesting, because out at Blackwater Draw, and the reason it's something special is because of the concentric lines of the Hunter-Schrager band pattern, or as they were originally called, the lines of Owen, for Sir Richard Owen in 1852. I know you were wondering about that. Because of the place where they cut this, you can actually orient this and place it in the tusk of the mammoth. And that, we'll come to that in a second. One of the things that was found at Clovis a number of years ago, and Jeff Saunders and some others, I think he's got co-authors on this, wrote a great article on what they called the semi-fabricate from Blackwater Draw. It was in American Antiquity a long time ago. It's about a 70 centimeter long section of tusk that had been girdled. They just pecked and pecked and pecked away at it, probably using a big biface, which I don't have sitting in front of me, and got it down to a thing about that big. It's weird. It was about that big. And they snapped it. Somebody probably stomped on it or hit it with a big rock or branch, I don't know, but they broke it. Set that aside and never used it. What's really interesting, and I don't know that it's from the same tusk, but this piece is from immediately proximal, so up tusk, back towards the skull, from where that animal had the end cut off. And here's where you see the last of the pulp cavity, the very end of the nerve. Think of this as the mother of all root canals. That little bit is
26 minutes.
The very end of the center of the tusk. So you can actually say that this is all dentin from the center, densest part of the tusk, immediately adjacent to where the pulp cavity ends. It's got a couple of big flakes on it, but it's a neat soft hammer billet. Not necessarily from that one other big tusk, but we're going to move along to a couple things that are also very strange here in Florida. This is probably Mastodon, could be Mammoth. It's a rib. It should go, back in here, but it's missing the ball, and it's a little hard on the cast to see it, but it's been chopped mercilessly and created what Webb and Dunbar called a hoe or mattock. It looks like a digging or chopping or poking a hole implement. There's one of them that we know of, and so really no idea exactly what's going on here. Another very interesting thing, this is part of a thoracic vertebrae. It's the spinous process, so if you feel the middle of your back, the one that always hurts, it comes out right here on the top of your vertebrae. What's missing is a chunk of it, probably comes to about here and has a knobbier end on it so that muscles can attach above your shoulder blades, or above your scapula in the case of this guy, Mastodon. And it is ground flat. And you can see there's striations even in the cast, but what's missing is about that much bone, almost as much as my thumbs, maybe a little bit less, but this thing should be that much higher and three-dimensionally, warped a lot more, and could be some sort of a braiding tool. I'm not really sure. No idea. I think there's fragments of 2 or 3 of these known now, and no idea. And again, these are both discussed in the Webb and Dunbar chapter, and it mentioned in Clovis Technology. Here, I always love using this, and if you're a small child watching this, or you show it to a small child, you have 2 of these in you. So obviously it's not a brain, but what is it? Well, it's a kneecap. In this case, it's a Mastodon kneecap, and it's missing about 30 or 40% of its mass. It should be way bigger. It's been chopped, pecked, ground, and thoroughly abused. Here's some more cancellous trabecular bone, the interior bone you could see. Suddenly I realized you could get that out of a kneecap of an elephant. My cast isn't great, but what on earth is this? Why did they make this? What were they doing with it? One thought is that it was put on my leg where you can't see it. Set on your knee, that it's used as an anvil so that when you're napping or wailing away on stuff, you're not going to bang it into your own, be cutting your leg or poking yourself. I'll do a couple more and then we'll probably quit, and I think what I'll do is just do another video on experimental work with bone and ivory and what that tells us about manufacture, use, and breakage on all these things. So, trying to make sure I don't miss anybody else. We honestly don't know how old this is, but it's a small dog jaw that's been cut. The horizontal ramus is ground a little bit. The ascending ramus, the one that goes like on us on the back of your cheek, the piece on their side, is gone. It's all chopped off, ground. No idea why they're doing this. Other examples have started to turn up now. This is a pair. This is the mandible of either the biggest darn wolf that ever existed, or probably, my guess is, a juvenile dire wolf. And there are now 5 individual sides that we know of. So what's happened here is the premolars and the canines and incisors have been cut off, basically just took right off, I can't do it I don't have much of a muzzle, but you know what I'm saying here. The front teeth are all gone, and what's happened on here is they drilled a little hole. The other side was broken, so it's not clear if that's what happened, and behind the M1 they drilled through it. I hope you can see that. It doesn't matter if you just see that it's hollow through it. Ascending ramus ground severely. Horizontal ramus ground quite a bit as well. And these are awful similar to what is exactly missing from Hopewell and other later period masks for presumably shaman, made out of mountain lion, bear, and wolf. And what it looks like is, I think we are looking at a dire wolf Pleistocene Clovis age mask that would have essentially been a part of a headdress. And like I said, there's now, I think, 5 of these that we know of from the Oscilla and the Wassissa. They should be other places too. I don't think there's some great behavioral thing going on in the Oscilla drainage that's different, but holy cow, between hints of ornamentation, the zipper design out at Wenatchee, the zigzags at Sloth Hole on the ivory piece. There's other examples, those tally marks I mentioned before. I don't have a whole lot, but when we start getting into far more formal headdress, mask kind of things, I think there's some serious gaps in our knowledge of what Clovis people were doing as part of their society, or whatever we want to call it when we start to get away from subsistence level discussions of how old things are, whether there's an association and whether they ate a mammoth or not. At a certain point, yeah, we've established that. Who cares? There's way more interesting things going on, and there's very little evidence about them that we've made sense of, and there's an awful lot more to do, and I think we should keep working on those things, because behaviorally there's some really interesting things going on that do in fact get every bit as complicated as Pleistocene old world things that these folks are descended from. So I guess we'll wrap it up there and come back and talk about experimentation in another video, because I could go a while on this, and I'm sorry about that. So anyway, thank you for watching, and we'll see you again.